Welcome back. In this video, we shall return once more to the topic of female onryo, in other words, female vengeful spirits. First of all, let's take a brief look at the development of this motif so far. Back in chapter 243, I discussed the popularization of female spirits, especially that of female onryo, that happened within Japanese art and literature during the Edo period. These motifs, and kaidan in general, continued to enjoy popularity even after the Edo period, and so when Japanese cinema took its first steps, Japanese horror cinema began with various successful kaidan film adaptations, many of which adapted stories of female spirits. This was followed by a decades-long outpour of ever-new kaidan movies, with many more revolving around female onryo or other kinds of female ghosts. Furthermore, the film Kaidan no Toshiana from 1968 was a great example of how Japanese horror movies began to combine these classical motifs with modern settings as well. Taking all this into account, I would argue that the recurring motif of female ghosts and female onryo in particular had also crossed over to the world of Japanese cinema, where it not only persisted but also evolved further, especially with the emergence of J-horror. Which brings us to the current video. But it also brings us to the question, when did J-horror actually emerge? Well, among the books I used when writing my graduation thesis back in 2009-2010, it was written that the films Joyure from 1996, this title could be translated as Ghost Actress, and Ringu from 1998, a film adaptation of Suzuki Koji's book Ringu from 1991, are considered to be the two works that truly kicked off the genre that is nowadays known as J-horror. Both films Joyure and Ringu were directed by Nakata Hideo with screenplay by Takahashi Hiroshi. Out of curiosity, I also did a quick Japanese internet search for the origin of J-horror while working on this video series, just so I would have some more recent sources, and I found several Japanese websites which all referred to Joyure or Ringu as the point when J-horror properly took off, so this seems to be a fairly solid theory. Now, what's interesting about the 1998 film adaptation of Ringu is how it displays a clearer gender distinction than the book, a distinction that actually reminds of the way the Edo period frequently associated women with the supernatural, because the 1998 film adaptation of Ringu clearly links its female characters to the curse and the world of the dead. For example, in the book, the main character is a man called Asakawa Kazuyuki, but in the film, the protagonist is a woman called Asakawa Reiko. Therefore, the final act of spreading the video's curse to others at the end of the film falls upon a woman. It's also a bunch of girls who are shown talking about and spreading the rumor about the cursed video at the start of the movie. Furthermore, one girl that eventually dies from the video's curse returns as a ghost and causes Reiko's son to watch the video, meaning that in this instance too, the curse is perpetuated by a female character. Another point, in the book, the character Sadako, who caused the cursed video to come into existence, turns out to be a hermaphrodite. The film from 1998, on the other hand, leaves out this detail, portraying her as an ordinary 100% female vengeful spirit. And her appearance in the movie as a woman with a white dress and long black hair is also reminiscent of the typical depiction of classical female onryo, such as Oiwa from Yotsuya Kaidan or Ukiku from the Sarayashiki Tales. Long story short, in the film adaptation of Ringu from 1998, it is mainly the female characters and female ghosts who are connected to fear and the spread of the curse. And I don't think, by the way, that this was driven by some conscious discriminatory intent, but rather that it was born from the aforementioned association of women with the supernatural that had become prevalent in the Edo period and has continued to persist ever since. As a side note, there also existed a much lesser-known television film adaptation of Ringu which premiered on Fuji TV in 1995 and was subsequently released on VHS and Laserdisc. This adaptation is said to have been a lot closer to the original book, but it never got released outside of Japan and doesn't seem to have had the same kind of impact that the 1998 adaptation had. Next, let's move on to the Ju-On series from Shimizu Takashi, which is probably best known for its two ghosts, Kayako and her son, Toshio. But before we can really talk about Ju-On, we need to take a little detour and talk about something called Gakkou no Kaidan. In a broader sense, this just means school ghost stories and refers to precisely that, to kaidan that are somehow related to any kind of school setting and that are often passed on by word of mouth. However, this concept eventually led to a Japanese horror teledrama series, also called Gakkou no Kaidan, that was aired on Kansai TV in 1994. This teledrama series was followed by various TV specials and many many prominent figures from the world of Japanese horror cinema actually worked on the Gakkou no Kaidan franchise at some point. For instance, scriptwriters like Takahashi Hiroshi, he would later be the scriptwriter for Ringu, Ringu 2, Ringu 0, Birthday, and more, or Konaka Chiaki, who among other things worked on the Honko AV cinema series from 1991 and 2, or directors like Kurosawa Kiyoshi, we'll actually talk about him in the next video, Nakata Hideo, who is well known as the director of Ringu, Ringu 2, or Honogurai Mizu no Sokokara, Tsuruta Norio, the director of the Honko AV cinema series amongst other things, and Shimizu Takashi, who would later create the Ju-On series. More specifically, Shimizu Takashi was one of the directors of a Gakkou no Kaidan TV special from 1998 called Gakkou no Kaidan G. But since he wasn't very experienced at the time, he was only allowed to create 2 very short horror films of about 3 minutes each, and these 2 short horror films would become the foundation of Ju-On. They were called Katasumi, which could be translated as in a corner, and well, that there. In the story, the title represents a phone number and most likely plays on the fact that 4 can be read as shi in Japanese, which is also how you read the kanji for death. These 2 short films already introduced both of the ghosts from the curse that the later Ju-On series deals with. In Katasumi, the ghost of the woman Kayako appears, while in the other short film, it's the ghost of the young boy Toshio. Well, and then, just 2 years later, Shimizu Takashi's first actual Ju-On film was released in 2000 as a direct-to-video film for Toei's V Cinema, followed by Ju-On 2, also via V Cinema. And although these versions of Ju-On didn't set any records in terms of sales figures, they were apparently scary enough to cause a lot of mouth-to-mouth propaganda, which eventually inspired the plan to make proper Ju-On feature films. This led to the production of 2 successful feature films of the same name, also called Ju-On and Ju-On 2. They were released in 2002 and 2003 respectively. Thereafter, American remakes followed, such as The Grudge from 2004, with Shimizu Takashi actually directing 2 of those remakes himself. More Japanese Ju-On films and even a rather recent Netflix series from 2020 followed as well. Now, as far as the topic of this video is concerned, the Ju-On franchise might not fit 100% at first glance, since it features 2 vengeful spirits, but only one of them, Kayako, is female. The other, Toshio, is a young boy. Still, the plot once again involves a woman who meets a tragic end due to the actions of her husband and turns into a female onryo, and that is something that should sound quite familiar at this point. Funnily enough, the film also features an extreme case of jealousy, which was often associated with women and their vengeful spirits in the Edo period, as we have seen in previous videos. But in Ju-On, it's actually the husband who is extremely jealous. His jealousy is what drove him to fly off the handle and murder Kayako, their son, and even the house cat. Now, unless I get a chance to ask Shimizu Takashi himself, I'll probably never know if that was just a coincidence or an intentional clever twist of classical motifs, but either way, I found it interesting enough to mention. Okay, last but not least, let's briefly talk about the film Honogurai Mizu no Sokokara from 2002. The title means From the Depth of Dark Waters. This film was directed by Nakata Hideo and is based on a short story called Fuyu Suru Mizu, which means floating water. This short story comes from Suzuki Koji's book Honogurai Mizu no Sokokara from 1996. So the film basically took on the same name as the book that contained the short story. Oh, and for those who, like me, have a hard time remembering Japanese names unless they hear them like a million times, allow me to point out that this book's author, Suzuki Koji, was also the author of Ringu, and this film's director, Nakata Hideo, was also the director of the 1998 film adaptation of Ringu. Now, in the case of this tale, it might be a bit much to call the female ghost an onryo perhaps, since the ghost here is just a little girl that died in an accident, but it's noteworthy that once again, the most important characters in this supernatural tale are all female. There is the mother Matsubara Yoshimi and her daughter Ikuko, who move into a rundown apartment, and there's the girl Mitsuko, who died 1 year ago when she fell into the water tank on the roof of the building, and who now remains in the building as a ghost. Furthermore, it's jealousy that causes Mitsuko's ghost to try and drown the young Ikuko and claim Ikuko's mother for herself. So, with the emergence of J-horror in films like Zoyure, Ringu, Ju-on, or Honogurai Mizu no Sokokara, it seems that the association of the female gender with ghosts, and with vengeful spirits in particular, had made the jump into the new genre of J-horror as well. That being said, there were actually two variations of this motif which could be witnessed with increased frequency. Variation 1, there was a lot more focus on children, with a supernatural entity sometimes being a female child and/or their backstory focusing a lot on their childhood, quite often portraying a girl with some kind of supernatural powers. This was also sometimes accompanied by depictions of some sort of conflict between the child and their parent or parents. Examples of this are the girl Mitsuko from the short story Fuyu Surumizu, from Suzuki Koji's book Honogurai Mizu no Sokokara, and from the film adaptation of the same name as the book. Mitsuko's parents both largely neglected her, leading to her subsequent death by accidentally falling into a water tank and thus to her transformation into a female ghost child. Sadako from Ringu, who wasn't a child anymore when she died, but her past as a child with supernatural powers plays a major role in both the books and the films. Her backstory in the books is quite different from that in the films, by the way, but this still applies to both versions of her. Or the character Alessa from the Japanese video game series Silent Hill, where she is depicted as a child with immense supernatural powers who was used as a sacrifice by her own mother. Now, I know this chapter still deals with horror cinema, so it might be a bit weird to list a video game example here, but Alessa's character fits extremely well into the pattern, and Silent Hill 1 was released in 1999, so it also falls into the same time period as works like Zoyure, Ringu, etc. On top of that, it's a nice example since it shows that this development wasn't just limited to Japanese cinema. Variation 2, there was a considerable increase in the depiction of vengeful spirits whose curse did not just befall those that were responsible for their unfortunate fate, but who instead indiscriminately targeted each and every one, including total strangers. Some examples of this are both Suzuki Koji's book Ringu and Nakata Hideo's film adaptation of the same name, or Shimizu Takashi's Ju-on series. This was of course not a new concept per se, however the frequency with which it became used in horror films and other horror works was definitely noteworthy. Let's think back to the Edo period once more, where at first you had the motif of a former wife turning into a female onryo and, following the Uwanari-uchi pattern, attacking the ex-husband's new wife while sparing the former husband. Then this motif eventually changed, and at some point you had tales of female onryo who also attacked their former husband. And now, with works like Ringu or Ju-on, you could see a popularization of female onryo whose curse went even further and who simply brought disaster upon each and any person that came into contact with them, no matter how guilty or innocent they were. Essentially, this means that you could connect some of the most representative J-horror works all the way back to motifs from the Edo period, which is quite a fascinating thought. And on that note, I would like to end this video. The next one will actually be the last big video on Japanese horror cinema, in which I will focus on one particular director whose rather unique horror movies are quite relevant to this video series. I hope to see you there. And as always, take care and goodbye.